Hi everybody. I want to go over today two things. I want to go over IES lights, when do I use them in my workflow, and I also want to go over some render settings. There's always a lot of questions on how many samples do I need in a rendering, or my ray bounces. So I just want to go over how I attack that and how I set up my settings for the rendering. But first let's talk about the IES lights. When do I use them? I will introduce the IES lights towards the end of my workflow when I'm just about ready to render the scene. So right now I have my car lit the way I want using the image-based lighting or the HDRI, and now I want to add a little extra pop or zing to the image. So this is without any IES lights. I'm going to turn on my IES lights so you can see the difference between the two. They're very subtle, but these lights really brought out a lot of shape to the vehicle, and tones and the materials look much richer now. So if I turn these back off, this is before, and now this is after. So let's go over these one by one so you can see my thinking behind this. So my very first light I put on here, I wanted to create a focal point to the car. So my focal point is going to be this front driver's side wheel right here. So my very first light I put on was a light that lights up the whole vehicle overall, and I put that light high in the scene. So as you can see, I'm getting a light across the whole driver's side of the vehicle, and I got some nice highlights going on in this back wheel. As I was looking at this, I noticed that my interior, I really couldn't see what was happening inside here. I know that there's a seat there, but I really couldn't see it. So I added another IES light above the seats or the interior so I can see a little bit more detail within this area. As I was looking at this, I was thinking this is looking really nice, but my front wheel is a little dead compared to my back. I want the focus to be in this area. I do have some nice lights and darks going on in here from the IES light from above, but I felt I needed another IES light. So I put another one by the driver's wheel, and then also I pulled out a little bit more shape in the sheet metal so you can see the before and after. Looks good, but it's kind of dead. This added a little extra pop to it, and now this is really starting to come out. Now I added one more light. I felt that this area here, I was losing some of this nice blue rich paint that you see in these areas of these highlights. So I added one more IES light for the passenger side front end, just so I can get a little bit of the color out of the paint. Now this still is a little too strong, so I tell you what, while I'm here, let's tone this down. So I'm going to go edit material, and now I'm going to go to 500. Actually, I'll go even lower than that. I'm going to go 400. Again, I don't want this to stick. I don't want this to be the brightest area of my scene. I want this area to be the focal point. So I don't want this light to be brighter than this area. That's why I toned this down. So if I go back to 1000, you can see this is starting to be the brightest part of the whole image, and I don't want that to be the focal point. So I'm going to tone that down, push it back into the scene, but at the same time still have some nice blue rich paint in that area. So that was my thinking behind these IES lights. I don't have a ground plane on in this scene. Now here's the interesting thing. If you go to your settings, you have self shadows, global illumination, and then you have ground illumination. If I turn on ground illumination, you'll see that the IES lights also affect the ground, and you'll start getting bounce light back into the sheet metal. So I'm going to turn that on. Now this comes to life even a little bit more with the light hitting the ground. And you're also now getting some bounce light back into the sheet metal and your materials, so you're creating a more inviting image. I mean, you can render this without the ground. This also looks good this way, but having some bounce light and some lights and darks on the ground itself really helps with the image. So again, just the before and after. I'll turn off the IES lights. Looks good. I can see all the shapes of the vehicle. I can see the materials. Needs that a little extra pop. I added 4 IES lights, and I consider this done, and I'm ready to render. So let's talk about rendering. All right, so we'll go into the render options here. Samples. What do I usually use for samples? 95% of the time, I keep my samples at 16. What I do differently is instead of cranking up my samples on the render, I'll crank up my samples on my materials I create. So if I show you this material, which is the paint, the samples are at 32. I think the default's like 8 or 9, so I turn those samples up to 32 on that material. I've also done it on my metals. Again, I'll look at the samples. I have it up to 29. Again, this is another one that's usually at 1 or 8 for the default, and I'll just do one more. My samples on this one is 32. So I increase my samples on the materials itself, but I render at 16 samples. Far as I know how that works is when this renders out, the whole scene is rendered at 16. Trust me, there's a lot of parts in this, and not every part has high samples. So when this is rendered out, everything's rendered at 16. Any material that I added samples to will be rendered out with the higher samples. So that's why I keep this number at 16, because I don't need all those extra parts that you don't see rendered at high samples because you don't see it. So I turn up the samples of only the parts that I see and within my shot, and I leave everything else low. So that's, at least that's the way I see how this works. My renders go relatively quick doing it this way. Ray bounces. This is another one that everyone has trouble with. I keep my ray bounces always at 16. I never go higher than that, but I'll never go lower than 16 either. Through the different testing, I've done different renders with higher ray bounces. And personally, I don't see the benefit of time compared to what it produces in the end. You can't really tell the difference between a 16 ray bounce image and we'll say a 24 ray bounce image. When it comes to exteriors of vehicles, interiors of vehicles, you might see a difference when you start if you're doing jewelry. But even in that, I always just do 16, and I really have some nice diamonds with just 16 ray bounces. So the time that you spent on a longer rendering to me is just not worth it for the result. So I always render at 16 samples, 16 ray bounces. My anti-aliasing I keep at 1. Ground shadows I keep between 3 and 5. Once in a while, if the ground's being difficult, I will turn it up to 10, but usually it's between 3 and 5. There's always exceptions to every rule. I usually have all 3 of these checked right here. Global illumination, that's another one that can really increase your render times. I always leave it at the default of 1. Again, I've done different renderings, seeing if I can see a big difference between global illumination being turned up. Again, the time waiting for the render to get done compared to leaving it at 1, to me it's just not worth the time waiting for that extra. So I leave that at the default of 1. My pixel blur I leave at 1.5, which is the default. For those that don't know what pixel blur is, the larger this number, the softer your image will be. The edges will be a softer image. The smaller this number, the crisper your edges will be, and you'll really notice it in your white highlighted areas. You'll start to see a lot more rastering going on. So I leave it at a 1.5, which is the default. If anything, I would go a little bit higher if I wanted a softer image. I would never go lower than 1.5. These are the settings that I usually use. Like I said, 95% of the time. That's how I use my IES lights. If you guys have any questions, my door is always open. I hope this helps, and I'll talk to you guys later.